Okay, so this is just a random video about how I make videos using Linux, and I'll talk about the hardware and software that I use. And this is all just a collection of anecdotes about equipment and techniques that I found useful, and your mileage may vary. Okay, let's go. All right, so before we get started, I just want to mention, if you go to the video description, there is a link to a GitHub page that has all of the details about the specific hardware and software that I will talk about. The HDMI Capture device I use is the Blackmagic Intensity Pro 4K, which is a PCI Express card. I got mine for about $150 used. You can get them new for $200. Basically, they're great. They'll capture 1080p video at 60 Hz, no problem at all. The drivers are great. Works with OBS Studio, which is the software I use for recording. I know a lot of people will just shoot with a camera and save video to a memory card and then transfer files from the memory card. I would far rather stream directly to the computer and capture directly onto the computer, and basically HDMI capture is part of that equation. I would avoid using cheap USB 3 no-name capture devices. You can find them on eBay and Amazon and so forth. I have one, and it kind of works, but mostly doesn't work, and they're just basically a nightmare to use. So the Intensity Pro 4K has always worked really well for me. The cameras that I prefer are the Canon Vixia HF-R series, and I have two of these. I have an R400, which is this guy right here. I also have an R600 that I have mounted permanently above my desk. And these you can find for, $80 or so used. And I believe that the R200 or higher should be good. I think the most recent one is the R800, but they're all very similar. The specs are 1080p video at 60 Hz, so pretty good quality. They have a good optical zoom on them for close-up shots. And most importantly, they have clean HDMI output. So basically you can take the HDMI output from the camera, and as long as you disable the on-screen display, which you can do through the menu, it basically, the HDMI output is just what the camera is capturing, and you can just feed that into your HDMI capture card and then record your video that way. So it's a very straightforward workflow. For a microphone, I would strongly recommend getting a cardioid mic, basically one where it is sensitive directionally so that it doesn't pick up as much background noise. The one that I use is a Fifine USB microphone from Amazon. I will link a image right there, and it's worked really well for me. I think it is fair to say that you will need to think a little bit about your computer setup, and that you will want to have a pretty reasonable CPU and a pretty decent amount of RAM in order to make video rendering work smoothly. The system that I use has a Core i7-4771, which is one of the higher end Haswell CPUs, and 16 gigabytes of RAM. And ideally, you will want to have a setup that allows you to use your GPU to accelerate video encoding during capture. If this is done in software, it will really bog down your system during capture, and you might even get poor video quality as a result. The good news is that, at least on the Intel end, the Haswell CPUs and later can do this accelerated encoding using the integrated GPU, and when I talk about OBS Studio, I'll show you my setup for doing that. So there are certainly other equipment that you might want to have. Clearly you're going to need some kind of lighting. I don't have great lighting. I just have a couple of cheap ring lights that I got on AliExpress. Works okay. You'll probably want to have some camera mounts to both mount cameras and also lights and other things like that. So the Magic Arm devices are quite good if you want a fixed camera setup. Let me put a picture of my mounted camera here. So anyway, you can figure that stuff out. The version of Linux I use is Linux Mint 19.3 Mate Edition. I don't think it's terribly important which version of Linux you use. Personally, I prefer Ubuntu-based distribution, so this version of Linux Mint is based on Ubuntu 18.04. However, I do think in general you will probably want to use a version of Linux that is fairly up-to-date, and in particular, I've only gotten GPU-accelerated video encoding to work because I upgraded to a relatively recent version, so that would be my recommendation. For video editing, hands down, I think Kdenlive is the best software to use. It's really pretty amazing. I have found only maybe a couple quirks with it. Other than that, it is just, really, really straightforward to use. It's awesome. Make sure that you use multiple threads for rendering, just to make sure that your renders, take as little time as possible. It does pretty well. I think I use 8 threads on my quad-core hyper-threaded CPU. So yeah, Kdenlive is really, really good. For video capture, I use OBS Studio. It works really, really well. It has built-in support for the Blackmagic Intensity Pro 4K, which is the HDMI capture card. Recent versions support GPU-accelerated video encoding. I will pop up my record settings just in case anybody finds them useful. But for me, this does do good quality hardware-accelerated encoding of video captures. Some of the other software I use is as follows. So for screencasts, I use Kazam, works really, really well. For graphics editing, for things like overlays, I use GIMP. For audio recording, to record narration that is sort of independent of video capture, I was using Audacity, but I've had some pretty awful problems with it lately, both sort of stuttering when capturing audio, and also the last time I tried to run it, it just couldn't even render its own UI. I don't know what's going on there. I'm using one that's just called Audio Recorder that is very basic but works really well. Alright, so I hope you found this video interesting and useful. I've definitely found that making videos on Linux is extremely feasible and a lot of fun. In terms of how much you might spend, if you replicate my setup or do something similar, you might come in, $300 or $400. It's not too expensive to get started. As I mentioned before, in the GitHub link from the video description, I'll have links to all of the equipment and software that is mentioned in this episode. All right, take care.